Um, we've got another presentation, which is actually the final session for today, and I'm going to actually call Mr. Abdul Hamid Carrim to the podium, who is a lecturer in the School of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics, and he's mainly involved in with teaching undergraduate students. He has a vested interest in assessment practices in the mathematical sciences, and he has completed the PGDIP in higher education at WITS and is also a recipient of the Vice Chancellor's Individual Teaching Award for 2023. I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Green.
Afternoon, everyone. I think I have the unfortunate task of being the last speaker for the day. So hopefully we can get our energy levels up a little bit. It's almost like I'm teaching a 2 to 5 lecture where the students have disengaged after a certain point. So I'll try and be concise. My talk is less of a formal presentation and more of just a case study of something that I've attempted in my lecture. So hopefully we can talk through this together. Like Nazira said, my name's Abdul Hamid. I'm a lecturer in the School of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics. And for the purpose of today's presentation, I wanted to focus on some ways in which I've introduced digital formative assessments in my lectures in order to enhance engagement and understanding. So I focus less on performance and, what does that, there was a lot of talk today about throughput and pass rates and the rest of it. But I think for the purpose of today's session, I'll focus more on engagement and performance per se. So let me just give you some background in terms of what the context was and what the motivation was for me to introduce a formative assessment in my course. So I teach a first-year course in applied mathematics, and a course size that's ranged between 450 to 550 first-year students. So it's quite a big class, and so there's associated challenges with assessing such a large group of students. When I took over teaching the course, and this was pre-COVID, I guess, that COVID transition has been a theme today also. When I took over the course, it was before COVID in 2019. And I guess like many of us, when you take over a course from someone else, when it's not a course you've developed, you're kind of immediately, gut reaction is to just do what the other person has done. And that's sort of what I did in 2019, went through the course. And what I found was the way in which the students were being assessed, or the way in which I was assessing the students, because it was a large class, we had to think of ways in which we could make the assessments, especially formal assessments, less tenuous in terms of marking, because there's 550 students, we don't have any tutors. And so we introduced multiple choice questions. So there were multiple choice questions already from the previous year. And what I realized is we'd gone through the test, or when we were going through the questions for the test, is those questions were all or nothing based multiple choice questions. They were quite detailed and structured, meaning that the question itself required long lines of calculation, and the only thing that was being assessed was the final output. I tell my students this all the time. I teach mostly first-year students, as Nazira said, but they all come with mathematical trauma, and I feel like if you're not in mathematics and you're in this venue, I think some of you have that mathematical trauma as well. And so that trauma just, sort of compounds itself when you have an assessment where it's an all or nothing kind of scenario, right? Your thinking, any critical thinking that you've done in between, any minor mistakes that you've done in between are not visible. It's only your final input, and it became an all or nothing. And so we tried to rethink the ways in which we were assessing students at that time. And one of the key feedback mechanisms that we got when we introduced some feedbacks, one of the key things that came across was students felt like they didn't feel like they had enough opportunities before the formal assessments in order to assess their understanding. In actual fact, the first time they were seeing those multiple choice questions were in a formal test situation. So they've not seen a multiple choice question. Obviously, they've seen multiple choice questions before, but not within the context of our course. And so then COVID happened, and I guess afforded me an opportunity with all the time that we had on our hands in 2020 to try and rethink that structure in which we were assessing students. And at the same time, I was doing the PG DIP, and I sort of, Prof. Stedham talked this morning about, Bloom's taxonomy, and he spoke about constructive alignment and sort of the shifts that he spoke about. But one thing that I noticed with my own practice was that while I'd sort of shifted some of my practices in terms of my classroom pedagogy, my assessments were still quite traditional. They hadn't sort of moved along with the ways in which I tried to change the way in which I was teaching the course. So the ways in which I assessed were still quite traditional. So I tried to spend some time on that, and I think COVID gave us that opportunity. The move towards sort of what we called emergency remote teaching and learning, as well as then our reliance on those technology enhanced environments. So all of those came together quite nicely. And for a lot of people who try to innovate, it sort of stemmed from having that time in 2020 and 2021 to rethink some of the practices um, that we were doing. So I'm in a room full of people who are more well versed on teaching and learning than I am, but let's just go through some sort of definition on formative assessment. So firstly, I've relied a lot on Black and Williams' work. So those of you that work in assessment, they've done quite extensive work on formative assessments. And so their definition of what formative assessments are all the activities undertaken by teachers. And then I think that for me, this is the important caveat, and by their students in assessing themselves, that provide information to be used as feedback to modify teaching and learning activities. Such assessment becomes formative when the evidence is actually used to adapt the teaching and meet the needs of the students. When the panel of students was speaking earlier, it was quite illuminating to me some of the things that they were saying regarding feedback and how feedback was not taken seriously in some of the courses that they were in. And so as a flip side, I think what's important also is how students grapple with feedback, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. So now we want to adapt this definition a little bit for if that's what a formative assessment is, what do digital formative assessments look like? Generally abbreviated as DFA. These assessments then include all the features of the digital learning environment that support the assessment of student progress and which provide information to be used as a feedback to modify any of the teaching and learning activities. So that's sort of just an incorporation of all the digitized technology enhanced environments that we have on top of Black and Williams definition that we saw prior. So thinking of some of the theoretical frameworks that underpin my thinking at the time, the first was constructivism. So how do students make meaning? How do students understand knowledge? And how do they gain that knowledge through a scaffolded learning environment where you as the more knowledge guides them towards better understanding and higher thinking through the pedagogies and assessment practices in the course. And again, feedback is an important mechanism here that I'll talk about as we talk about the assessment itself. But I want to speak about this idea of self-regulation and the self-regulated learner. And in actual fact, recently at our last teaching and learning meeting, Prof. Nicole came to speak to us about the next 5 years in the teaching and learning plan that will be incorporated for BITS. And one of the focus areas for the next 5 years is specifically around empowering students as self-directed learners. So while this was alluded to in our previous plan, it wasn't a specific focus area. But I think as we all know, those of us that were taught during the COVID times, is that we relied a lot on students developing themselves or regulating and directing their own learning. So it's now a focus area for the next 5 years, and I think it's going to be something that is going to be a challenge that we will face for the next 5 years. So my particular interest here, so there's many ways. Formative assessment is quite a broad umbrella term, and there's many ways in which we can assess students in a formative way. We've just seen the previous speakers talking about that in some capacity as well. My interest was how do we activate students as owners of their own learning? So this is from William M. Thompson, which gives us a guide in terms of where the learner is right now and how do we get there. And so I've situated myself there in activating students as owners of their own learning. And I want to maybe say this at this point is that formative assessment we shouldn't think of assessment specifically as a tool for learning, but rather an approach to learning. When we think about assessment as a tool, then it becomes test one, test two, assignment, exam. It's a tool, right? And the pathway from tool to instrument is a very short path. Thinking of the tool then as the instrument to measure student performance is a very, very narrow path. And I think sometimes we tend to instrumentalize tools far too quickly. And so I just wanted to mention that assessment should be an approach. It should be something that's dynamic. It's not those static assignments and tests that are scheduled throughout the semester, but something that's incorporated and changes as students' learning changes. Then those of you that work in assessment and feedback will be quite familiar with Nicol and McFarland's 7 principles for feedback. So I've just put this here to highlight some of the principles that I wanted to incorporate in this assessment, in this formative assessment, particularly facilitating student self-assessment. And for me, this idea of motivation and self-esteem is important. How does assessment develop students in terms of their confidence and in terms of motivating them to do well in the course? And like I said, with mathematics, the challenge is not just in having students to get rid of trauma that they have, but also unlearning at the first year level, it's unlearning some of the assessment practices that are ingrained within them. And I don't know how many of you teach first years in the audience, but it's a big challenge to get students to unlearn some of those ways in which they've been inducted into, especially in terms of assessment. So how do we use then specifically a digital formative assessment as a tool for self-assessment? Black and William talk about self-assessment as an essential component of formative assessment. And that relates to what we spoke about in terms of the self-regulated or self-directed learning. However, I think sometimes when we incorporate things in our course, and I think the students articulated themselves quite well in the panel session, is I think we should question how much time do we spend inducting them into those new ways that we are incorporating into our course? Do we just put them out there and assume that they're going to know what they're doing? Or do we spend time explaining to them if it's going to be productive? Do we train them in self-assessment so they understand what the purpose of that tool is, and how what do they need to do in order to achieve in that using that tool? And I think here, having discussions with students when you want to incorporate something new, having a dialogue with students about something you want to introduce, really, first of all, empowers them in the learning process. They feel as if they're included in the learning process. And I found even with those 4 or 5 students that were on the panel that there's some richness in their responses also that can assist you and guide you in how you design the assessment itself. So I think getting students to be co-constructors of assessment is a useful tool. It doesn't mean that you're no longer the instructor or the lecturer of the course, but rather that students feel as if we're building something together. And when you build something together with them, it's almost like you've entrapped them in a way, because now it's like we've decided on this together. There's some sort of shared responsibility that we now have because we've agreed to do this together. And that sort of way in which you train students, so induct them into that process, is what Black and William refer to as disciplinary habits of mind. How do we incorporate how do our formative assessment practices give students epistemological access to the discipline? And I think that's an important consideration, and something that prior to this, I wasn't giving students that opportunity to do so or to develop those habits. So I'll go through some of the ways in which I implemented this in my course. So I've written here that it was a low stakes quiz, but actually it was a no stakes quiz. There was no stakes attached to it, right? There was no participation credit. There was no mark that I was recording. It was purely for students to do as formative in nature as possible. So the way in which I constructed it was sort of the way in which we all assess sort of students. There were short multiple choice questions, matching questions, short answers. And I purposely decided to not call them. So Prof, I think Gerrit this morning spoke about concept tests in one of the lectures. He used an example of a concept test. And I tried to steer away from using the word test, assessment, assignment, assessment. for this particular task that I wanted them to do. And in another team teaching, in another course that I was team teaching on, we used to call those formative tasks, did you get it? Okay, for short, we used to call them digits. And so I borrowed that term from that course. So that's another first year large class that we were teaching. And so I incorporated these did you get it into my course. And these did you get it are short quizzes, but they're interactive. What that means is if a student chooses an answer, it gives them some response and it directs them. If the response was incorrect, it tells them why it was incorrect and they get to attempt it again. So there's interactive, immediate feedback and the students can incorporate their feedback in their response. Now, those of us that teach sort of the large first year maths courses or chemistry or biology, you know that there's large resources available online in terms of these quizzes and these question banks. They're available to us. And some people may be using them in the course, but I constructed these questions myself, which took a lot of time. But I think the benefit of that is that it's not just something you book ending into your curriculum that someone else has constructed, which may not always align with your own learning outcomes and your own curriculum. Especially if you're drawing from a lot of the resources that are available out there are from global north institutions, especially from the US and UK. And those their curriculum is very different. The structure of the curriculum is different in terms of where things are placed within the student's degree. And so sometimes something that I'm teaching at first year, students may only see in second year or vice versa. So there's a misalignment there. So using those online tools that are available to us, we've always got to be a bit cautious in terms of, does it actually align with my own teaching needs and my own curriculum? And so I didn't find anything out there that was suitable for me. And so I constructed these myself. Typed up all the feedback for each option myself. So that took a lot of time to develop. And I didn't obviously do it all immediately, but it does take a lot of time. And that's maybe one of the drawbacks of, developing formative tasks. So like I said, it allowed students to check their understanding of key concepts. Each option has granular feedback. So it tells them what they've done right or what they've done wrong, but there's also general feedback. So there's the way I set it up is a student can attempt it twice, a question twice, so they can attempt it once. If they get an incorrect answer, use the feedback, attempt it again, and then there's no other attempt. Then it gives them general feedback. That general feedback maybe directs them to some section in the course notes to revise, or this is where the concept is situated, and you can come back and try it again. Because they can reattempt the entire quiz. So they can do the quiz an infinite number of times, and I'll show you some of the data surrounding that. And they can also track their progress by receiving a grade. So they get a grade, but that grade, I don't record it. I'm not looking at it. That's just for them. Because I feel like, Prof. Osman this morning kind of challenged us to think of the ways in which us as the university are also complicit in some of the ways in which students learn. And my view is that sometimes our focus does become a lot on that grade, and less on the learning that's associated with that grade. And I think that moving away from, this idea of the grade is not just something that us as leaders in the institution need to be thinking about, but students are very much inculcated in that same thinking. Because when you do something that doesn't count 4 marks, then you get the question: is it counting? Does it count? How much? If it doesn't count, then the question is, do I need to do it or not? And that's why it's important that students are co-constructors of the assessment, that they understand what the nature of the assessment is, what the reason is, and how we're going to use anything that comes out of that assessment. So I've tried to embed those seamlessly into the LMS. Something that the students pointed out was how some lecturers may use the LMS as a dumping ground for funds. That's literally what the students said, right? And that's something that comes up time and time again when we talk about the LMS. And so I try to be more specific about where do I place those assessments. So I just place it wherever and assume that students are going to do it. So I'll show you where it's situated on the LMS. So it's situated for each week. It's within that week plan for that section. Obviously, there's real-time feedback. The benefits of being on the LMS, or the reason why this digitization of the formative assessment is useful, is because that real-time feedback is there, right? I may not be directly giving the students the feedback in real time, but I've incorporated my feedback in the construction of that question. And so they're getting that in real time as they're doing the question. I can then also track their performance, how much time they're spending on the task, when they are doing the task, because the task is novel. When students do it for the first time, it's a novel approach for them. So they're quite excited by it in the beginning. But then as the semester goes, then engagement also drops a bit. So the novelty of it is something that is a challenge. Um, when students do it is also a challenge because the way in which I structure the course is all of these tasks must be done before I meet them for the lecture. So even the formative task, they must do it before we meet so that we can discuss those things in the lecture space. And sometimes students either, as the students pointed out, they have other things going on and they don't have the time maybe to do it, or they don't see the benefit of doing it for the lecture. And so you'll see a spike in their attempts the day before the test or the 2 or 3 days before the test. So they may be engaging in it, but maybe not at the times that I wanted them to engage with it. Which as I was going through the presentation, I was thinking, is that big? Is that much of an issue for me? I haven't answered the question yet, but it's something that I was thinking about as I was putting through the presentation. The last thing that the LMS provides you is this way to communicate with students in real time. If you see something is going on in an assessment, you can intervene immediately, whether that is by clarifying concepts. If you're seeing a lot of the students are getting the same question wrong, you can intervene by clarifying the concepts. If you see that a student specifically is struggling and you want to intervene for some personalized support, you can do that also. In a big class, when you're the only lecturer, that does become a bit of a challenge. So may not be so clear here, but I put up an example. So this is a question that I've taken. You can see that the student has answered the question and there's some feedback. So I put it all in one slide, but the student will first see this feedback. So the feedback says the answer that you've chosen is partially correct. However, it doesn't account for this. And so the student has an opportunity to attempt it again. And then when they don't get the question correct, is then a general feedback comes up that either clarifies the question or points them elsewhere. What I also do is, so for my course, I have a digital notebook that the students, so this is the notes that the students access. So after each section, you'll see that I've embedded the Did You Get It as part of the course material. So the student doesn't need to go to the LMS to find that week's questions for them to attempt. It's embedded through this link that takes them directly to the LMS where the question is situated. So you can see there's some questions that precede this Did You Get It, which is the exercise. Then the Did You Get It is there and the students can access it directly from there. The other thing that I've tried to do in my course, I mean, I go back to the student panel discussion, is that they're very well versed in even the educational terms that we think they may not know. And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to be very open with them, and I've called it, this is in my notes, and I've said, this is a formative task. It does not count for marks, but please do it on your own to ascertain your own learning. So I try to be open about what the task is. Let's name it. We don't need to be scared of the name. And let's talk about what it actually means. So I think streamlining it and putting it within the course structure itself and having it embedded in your course material somehow makes a huge difference in terms of students' engagement with it. Talking about engagement, so the impact of student learning, I would rather think about student learning through these four, using these four criteria. The first, you'll notice performance is the last one. So the first is engagement. So how does that formative assessment task get students to think critically and participate in the course in an engaging way? The second then is motivation. How do those strategies help to motivate students to take ownership of their own learning? So how does that task itself direct them to become more motivated? Then understanding, how does that particular assessment, formative assessment, develop better understanding within those students through that scaffolded learning and by that guided feedback? What I noticed, even the students that were engaging with the course just a few weeks ago, a student came to ask me one of the questions from the Did You Get It during the break or at the end of the lecture. And I asked the student, did you engage with the feedback? And she said no. So even students themselves need to be inculcated into engaging with feedback in a meaningful way. When you publish an assignment, whether you publish the solutions or you publish your guidelines for how they're supposed to have structured their answer, oftentimes it's the mark first that they're interested in. And then if I have time, I'll look at what I was supposed to have done. So I tried to foreground through this assessment, what is it that you didn't understand? as opposed to what mark did you get. And then lastly, performance. How does that low-stake assessment help students to clarify any current misconceptions that they have, consolidate the concepts that they understood before those formal assessments, and thus improve performance in some way? So what I'm going to do now is just show, first of all, some quantitative data from the LMS, where I've tried to track student engagement and performance. So I've done that so I've put up 3 metrics here, but I've chosen 2 for today. So the first is the number of attempts. So the insights that I want to get from this is, does this indicate the effort and persistence or reveal areas that are challenging or misunderstanding for students? How many attempts do they do? Because like I said, they can do it an infinite number of times. And then the score trend. So lastly, I've left out time spent. Score trends, can I get some evidence there of their progress and the effectiveness of these interventions? So I've just in tabular form just showed the data. So this is 2023, so from last year. So I'm currently teaching the course. That's why I can't show you all of the data from 2024. But this is each of the assessments. So 1 through 8, it's a semester course or module. And I teach, actually it's a year module. I teach the second semester of that module. So the first data is the number of first attempts, graded first attempts. So you can see the first quiz had 334 first attempts. The last one had 196. So you can see the difference in, it averages out a little bit in sort of 2, 3, 4, and then has a different, drops a little bit, but it averages out here between 5, 6, and 7. But you can see a bit of a decline from the first to the last. But what's interesting to me is the number of completed, the total number of graded attempts. So this is how many students have attempted it, regardless of whether it's counting each attempt. So if a student's done it 5 times, it's counting 5 of those attempts. So you can see sort of the novelty here. The first assessment, 624 unique attempts of the assessment, and the last one, 309 unique attempts of the assessments. And then I've also shown the average grade of the first attempts. So this is what they got on their first attempt, what they got on all their attempts, and what they got on their last attempt. So obviously in the tabulated form, we can't see that so clearly, so I'm showing it here. So you can see, so the orange line is their first attempt. So you can see where that first attempt lies there for each of the assessments. The green line is the average of all of the attempts, regardless of how many times they've done it. So that's that line. And the blue line is the average of the final attempt. So you can see the difference in when they've attempted it the first time, the average of all of their attempts, and then their final attempt. So you can see the gradual increase in what they've, so obviously this is a score of what they achieved. You can see an increase in each of them. You can see an increase in how they've performed in each of those assessments. You'll see that there's some drops here and some peaks here. So because I teach the second semester, some of the concepts are mirrors of the first semester. So probably this one here, which students achieve quite well. And then these dips are later into the semester where the concepts become a little bit more challenging, and you can see a little bit of a struggle there in them understanding those concepts. So Sadler speaks about how the formative assessment task can then inform future instructional decisions. So if you see this happening, can I intervene then the next week? Because they've all had a dip here in this this week, and so some of the concepts in this week must have been challenging. So can I go through them in the next session to clarify any of their current misunderstandings? I've actually put up some feedback for the block, so I've just put it up, but I thought it would be useful to show some of the data that's come out of that. So I think there's about 55 attempts or 55 responses thus far from the students. So this is just sort of feedback that I've asked them to determine what the third block rather looks like. So the question I posed to them was, did you get it on Moodle? So I should have said that we use Moodle in the computer science and applied mathematics as opposed to Ulwazi. We don't only use Moodle, but mostly Moodle for our courses. So the question was, did you get it on Moodle and embedded in the digital notebook helped reinforce my understanding of key concepts? So I use a Likert scale here, and you can see thus far, 60% of the responses were on strongly agree. I think that's a good indicator that they do think that this is useful for them, but I'll reinforce that by some of the qualitative feedback that I've received from students. So the first is, did you get it? I remember the name without looking. was a stroke of genius. It was engaging and it helped to check if you got it. The did you get it helped to identify what I don't know. The questions after the content kind of just reinforce the knowledge you've acquired while studying and allowing you the chance to apply what you have just learned immediately after learning. The quizzes were very helpful and effective. The videos that accompany the notes, as well as the educators, have been the most helpful to my learning. They've helped me to assess whether or not I've properly understood the concept of the week. The educators helped to practice. The tutors going through the questions helped us to get an understanding how to actually answer the questions. And the use of technology was very effective. So you can see that in some of the feedback that students have given, that they see the benefit of that intervention or of that assessment for them to get a sense of whether they've understood the concepts in real time. Lastly, just to end off, I know we short on time a little bit, but some of the sort of challenges and considerations. The first that I mentioned, which is not on the slide, is resistance from students. Is, how do you get them to understand why this is necessary, why it doesn't count for marks, but I still want you to do it? So that resistance from students is a challenge. The novelty, like I said, is a challenge also. How do you get sustained engagement in the assessment after the novelty wears off? Because there is that novelty component to it. From the instructional perspective or from the lecture perspective, time management is a key consideration because designing and implementing these formative assessments can be very time consuming, especially if it's in a digital space. It requires a lot of planning and resource allocation. So, sitting down and just starting to type up a question is not going to it's not going to be beneficial. You've got to spend time to construct those questions, construct the feedback. So it does require a lot of planning and also, resource allocation. If you can get a TA or someone to assist you with that, it makes all the difference. We have had some conversations about access and equity. So when I started out, like I said, we were doing this during COVID. And so there was some, consideration that I had to have about, first of all, the digital literacy. Were students going to be able to do this? Sometimes we don't, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it today, but sometimes maybe we don't give students a full benefit of what they're capable of. But we've also got to take into account access to technology, access to resources, et cetera, et cetera. Then the other challenge, which I mentioned prior, is the de-emphasizing of grades and the foregrounding of feedback. It's a challenge, right? How do we get students to understand that the feedback that you're getting on this assessment is important, and because there's no grade, how do I use that feedback? How do I incorporate that feedback and make that a measure of my learning as opposed to the grade itself? So I think I'll leave it there. For now, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul Hamid. Um, there, there is a question on, before we move to that, are there any questions here from the audience? Any questions, any comments? Fatima?
Ask,
Yeah.
so from the assessments that gave you pause to possibly engage in a redesign of the curriculum, apart from the students, reinforcing their learning, but it worked in a sort of dual way, for want of a better word.
Absolutely, absolutely. So actually, in tandem with this, I didn't speak about it as part of today's presentation, but in tandem with restructuring the assessment, I restructured the curriculum as well. So it was sort of a dual process. It may not all have happened at the same time, but at the end of it all, there was a restructuring of both the curriculum and the assessment.
Right, thank you for that. So there is a question online. I think you've partially answered that, right, in your last slide. But the second part of it, perhaps you can handle that, right? Do you think your approach is moving away from the marks grading culture? And is the granular feedback promoting more engagement with feedback and promoting student agency?
So I think the granular feedback is important because it's not generic. It's not something that's just directing them to say, oh, well, you didn't understand how to find a solution to a differential equation. It's more detailed than that. So I think, I don't want to call it personalized feedback because that's not what it is, but from the student's perspective, it leads as personalized feedback because it's targeting their specific misconception. So I do think that that's increased their engagement. In terms of grades, I think that's a challenge that we're not going to solve today. I think that for me, the sweet spot is, and that's why I still assign a grade to the students, even though I don't count it, because they still want that. There's a reluctance even from their side to move away from that grade. So I think that there's a lot of challenges with moving away from graded assessments, not just for a course itself, but for a degree, for just even if students enrolled in a degree, it becomes a challenge when how do we compare something that's graded with something that isn't? So, like I said, for me, the sweet spot is, if I give another example, in another course that I teach, uh, the assessment is, I assess it through a rubric, but there's also a grade attached to that. So there's a dual purpose there. So the rubric definitely gives them more of the feedback, but there's a mark attached to it because I have to mark them in some way.
Yeah, unfortunately, our programs are on merit, and in order to be a graduate, you've got to be graded. So, another question is based on the students, your participant cohort. Um, was the improvement in their grades? Did the assessments actually improve their performance in the course overall?
I purposely didn't want to show the grades because it's very difficult to measure that was the reason why the students' grades had improved. I can show the grades and show, there's definitely been an increase in the pass rate from 2019 to now, but I don't think I can pinpoint that the formative assessments are the reason for the increase in the grade. So that requires more detailed statistical analysis. But yeah, I can't say for certain that the title of my talk was about engagement and understanding, and that's what I tried to focus on. My perceptions of students' um, engagement in the course as well as the understanding, and I do think that the formative assessments have improved in both of those aspects.
And from me, I just wanted to know, do you feel that you needed to actually socialize your participants in terms of receiving meaningful feedback, or I mean, were they socialized? Or
I think so.
yeah,
I think so. I mean, like I said a few weeks ago, when a student who was participating in it, doing the task, was not engaging with the feedback. So there's still some gap there in terms of, well, they've done the task, but have they gone and looked at what the feedback means? So I do think that there's some incarceration that needs to happen for students to grapple with feedback. And I think that that's, at the first year level, there's only so much you can do in terms of time. But I do think that that's something that, and I think when going through the presentation, I also thought about that. This was a first year course, and maybe as they do this often, that those other things fall into place a little bit easier.
it's around online the digital assessments, right? So there is a comment there that maybe you should look at Wally Morrow, who defines epistemological access, and maybe, just maybe, EA may help you, in how you communicate the value or benefits of moving beyond grades or focusing on the learning. So I'd suggest you go through the chat.
I will do.
There is a link there as well. Thank you to Prof. Agabi.
Thanks. Bye. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is, you earlier on mentioned that your class is in the order of 500 students, and you have been using MCQs as assessment. And what you have presented is essentially formative assessment for engagement. So has there been any change with the summative assessment? What are you using for that?
I should have mentioned that. So the summative assessment now is a mix of MCQs and written questions. So it's not just a full MCQ exam or test. There'll be, I would say, 20% or 25% would be MCQs, and the rest of it is written questions, where the students have to actually demonstrate understanding in long form submissions. So I've moved away from a full MCQ format that was done previously to a mix of the two.
Thanks so much. That was a really fabulous presentation, and it speaks quite powerfully to implementing seemingly small things that actually make, I think, a big impact. If I could be so cheeky as to ask you to expand on your comment about, sometimes students don't do it before class time and you're undecided about whether that's a
Yeah.
problem. In humanities, that is often cited as a big problem by
Right.
lecturers, right?
Right.
And I'd be very interested to hear from you, even if just what would one argument be in favor of saying it's not a train smash if students don't come to class having done, say, the formative assessment?
So I was of the same view, that it loses the value if they're not doing it. But I've started to think about it differently, that they're doing it eventually. And today I thought about what is the agency that I'm giving to students if they're choosing not to do it at that time. Especially because the concepts that I'm teaching are mirrors of the first semester. Maybe they've decided this concept, I don't need to check. I know my understanding. So I'll check it later. I don't need to do it before the lecture. So I feel like maybe there's a balance there. There's definitely students who are not engaging, but I feel like maybe there's some agency to be given to students who are choosing to do it at their own time and not when I prescribe for them to do it. And also that they choose that this is not important for me to do right now. And I think that that's maybe this morning I was thinking about those two things. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, okay, we'll take one final question and then we need to tie up.
I can hear.
Your module and understanding how mathematics is, and some of the lecturers are doing it when they're teaching. So I'm more interested in finding out, how are your colleagues receiving your approach in teaching? So are they positive towards it, or
So,
yeah?
so like I said, the idea from this was not in my idea, right? So our team taught in another course, and I took the idea of those tasks from that course. So within the school that I'm teaching, there are other people who are doing this. Maybe not everyone's doing it, but there's certainly people who are doing it, doing the same type of formative assessments within the courses that they teach. So there's definitely a culture within the school of formative assessments.
Okay, thank you so
Thank you.
much, Abdul Hamid. This was so interesting, and I think you got the audience there. So I'm going to hand over to a warm round of applause.